Olá, a minha webcam não está funcionando aqui. Mas dá para ouvir o áudio e eu já vou entrar, tá, gente? Falando em inglês para vocês fazerem a tradução, mas eu entro pelo celular, só um minutinho. Nossa. Oi, pessoal. Estamos aqui na Lio testando a tradução. Vamos ver se funciona. Eu vou entrar pelo celular, só um minuto, é melhor, Fernando. Pessoal, vamos lá. Aqui pelo celular fica melhor para mim, senão tem um retorno ruim aqui. Eu vou começar a falar inglês e aí a Fernanda confirma, por favor, se vai dar para escutar a tradução das meninas. Hello everyone, we are here at Leo Learning and we are trying to do the translation, and we are testing my cell phone and my camera and my computer. Yesterday everything was all right, and now I think that everything is okay. I use the StreamYard to do the translation, and this is it. It's cool, and it's a good website to do the translation. Fernanda, everything is okay, so we finish. Bye-bye.
Boa noite a todos. Estamos aqui em mais um excelente momento do Sinagel para apreciarmos mais uma grande fala de um grande convidado. Na noite de hoje, nós vamos escutar as falas do professor Gary John Brierley. Ele é um dos grandes especialistas em geomorfologia fluvial, né, um dos grandes pensadores sobre o entendimento de como os rios, né, se originam e quais as dinâmicas que os rios desenvolvem, quais os processos que os rios desenvolvem. Então, ele é um grande especialista sobre a ciência fluvial, né? E, além disso, o professor Brierley também é um grande cientista atuante na aplicação de gerenciamento de rios, de grandes rios, né, principalmente em rios que necessitam de reabilitação e conservação. Então, o professor Brierley também é um grande conhecedor das paisagens brasileiras, especialmente do Nordeste do Brasil. Nos últimos anos, ele tem visitado o Nordeste do Brasil, conhecendo vários estilos fluviais, várias demandas do gerenciamento de drenagens, em Pernambuco principalmente, mas na Paraíba também, em Alagoas, em Sergipe, né, visitando, além de várias drenagens, também o Rio São Francisco. Posteriormente, também visitou a Bacia Amazônica. Então, o professor Brierley é um grande amigo da ciência fluvial brasileira e um entusiasta da produção do conhecimento sobre ciências fluviais, sobre a aplicação dos estilos fluviais e o desenvolvimento dessa ciência, o desenvolvimento de vários métodos, a aplicação de métodos e sobre o desenvolvimento de pensamentos não apenas sobre o rio em si, mas também sobre a bacia de drenagem, com todos os seus agentes, tanto agentes naturais, físicos, como também agentes humanos, agentes sociais. Quando ele sempre, em visitas às áreas próximas aos rios, ele sempre dizia, olha, a gente tem que sempre lembrar de conversar com os ribeirinhos, tem que sempre falar com as pessoas que vivem o rio. Então, o professor Brierley não apenas é um daqueles que estuda a dinâmica natural das drenagens, mas também se preocupa muito com a forma de gerir essas drenagens, lembrando que essa gestão deve ser sempre uma gestão participativa, levando em conta tanto o conhecimento da ciência, como também os conhecimentos tradicionais. Então, nós ficamos muito felizes em ter o professor Gary nesta edição do Sinagel, e acredito que vai ser muito bom e vai ser muito contributivo para todos nós acompanharmos o que ele tem a nos dizer, e posteriormente a gente pode atuar aí na leitura de algumas pequenas perguntas que possam surgir para a gente conversar um pouco com ele mais tarde. Então, acredito que ele já está disponível. Professor Gary, it's a pleasure to meet you again. So I think you can feel free to start.
Yep. Thanks greatly, Clayton. It really is an honor to have this opportunity. I've just been watching the landscape images that you've got for your conference and the photographs, and I'm just in awe. And we're in lockdown in my part of New Zealand at the moment, right, in Aotearoa, and we're desperate for the transition that is imminent, and we cannot go into the field at the moment, so we are just dealing with landscapes in the virtual sense of them. And part of my talk will be about some of the limitations that goes from that, and the importance of field practice and sharing opportunities with each other that come from this. So it's very hard for me in these kind of situations not to see faces and not to know what I'm talking to. And I will have a break during my talk so that if people have questions or comments, we can at least I can check that there are people out there and I'm not just talking into thin air, right? But I'll get into it. I'll share my screen and get into my talk. I say I will do that, but I cannot actually see my image at the moment.
I think the host will put the screen on the video.
Yeah, I need to be able to see my screen. At the moment, I can only see the image that from yourself. Maybe I just hit share and I'll see what happens.
Yes, she's saying that that's not up to her. Okay, yeah. Now it's okay.
Can you see the screen? Yes. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, I will put it full size and away we go.
So, can you please put on a full screen?
Yes, I will, for sure.
Okay.
So we're ready.
And please click on hide on this.
Yes, I will do that for sure.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, Clayton, and the organizers, and I'll get into this now. So as I said, it's quite an impersonal way to be doing these kinds of things, but we make the best of the situations that we're in. And I will apologize. From a few years ago, I was supposed to be coming to Sinagio, and things didn't quite work out as they should have at that occasion. And just yesterday, I had a conversation with Mike Crozier, and he sends his very best regards to everyone in Brazil, because like myself, he's had some amazing experiences in that part of the world, in your part of the world. This is a shared presentation with Professor Kirsty Friars from Macquarie University in Sydney, and you'll see through the talk many parallels in terms of the nature of the landscapes and the circumstances that we talk to. These Gondwanan landscapes talk to us in very distinctive ways, I think. First, I just want to extend my sincere thanks to the organizing committee. It's really wonderful for me to have this opportunity. And when we're stuck in lockdown, it's great to be doing productive things and sharing stories, and who can't enjoy sharing landscape perspectives. And both Kirsty and myself thank our host institutions and the people who supported our work along the way. And obviously, anything to do with the kind of work that we do impacts greatly on our personal circumstances, and we thank our friends and families for their support along the way. I imagine if I was in Brazil right now, I would love to be at a stage with a caipirinha in hand, right? And preparing this talk has made me reminisce quite significantly. And right now I have a connection associated with going to a football match with Nelson, and a bucket of caipirinha. That's the best way I can describe it. And I think we remembered some of the soccer, but I think that the caipirinha was more memorable for me. Just so many great friends in Brazil. It's really just such a shame that we can't be here face to face, but I have very strong memories going back quite a long way, right back to the 1990s with I distinctly remember a field trip, a regional geomorphology field trip that was held at UFRJ, and the profound experience for me of the biogeomorphic work that Ana Luisa Coelho Neto and others were conducting at that time, and it just reframed ways of seeing landscapes for me. And I really do have some very deeply etched landscape impressions, but personal friendships. And I really do feel as though that place is a part of me. I grew up in Northwest England in Manchester, and yet somehow those landscapes, particularly the Gondwanan elements of them, there's just something that just gets into your bones somehow. So Clayton and Monica and Jonas and Antonio and Guilherme and Miguel and Rafael and countless others whose names I have overlooked, excuse me, but I just have, I feel as though I'm with you in spirit, at least. So what's the motivation for what I'm doing and what I have done through my career. Obviously, as a geomorphologist, as a practitioner of landscape science, I'm also conscious of a role and responsibility and a quest to make the world a better place. And one of the things I'm really delighted to see in the last short while has been massive engagement with concerns for geoethics and the promotion of this. And I think places like Brazil, this is a particularly important issue because of so many profoundly significant land use and climate change type issues that must be addressed. We have a role as practitioners in our science not to stand aside from this, from my perspective. We are the advocates for the voice of the landscape in a way. And if we don't do our job properly, then the perspective from the landscape is underplayed. And I think simply from an Indigenous landscape connections perspective, that's a tragedy. In fact, it's unethical for us not to put these kinds of things forward. So to me, these are questions of morality. It's part of my motivation is quest for social and environmental justice. And obviously, these are very, very pressing times for us in terms of climate change adaptation, biodiversity loss, and the recognition of how do we engage in an era of river repair. We know that we need to be doing it. We've at least recognized the issue. But in my opinion, we're not doing this anything like as well as we perhaps could, should, ought to be doing. And part of my talk will be to reflect on some of the frustrations at the interface between science and management and the decisions that we've made, the choices that we have made in how we're choosing to live with the world, with rivers, with each other. And what's our role? What's our place as geoscientists in these deliberations? And to me, from where we come to shape these kinds of things or to think about these things, there's an inherent politics, geopolitics to these things. And I'm going to put my cards on the table straight away. I would never be a good player of poker or anything like that. It's with Gary, you get what you get. And this is a slide from my first year lectures at the university. Your lecturer today, Gary Brierley, the presenter of this sort of keynote, is a watermelon. I'm very much framed by that green exterior and concern for for environmental values that permeates everything that I do. But to me, everything that we do from that green exterior, that environmental focus, reflects the nature of the societies within which we live and how we interact with each other through that. And that perspective has underpinned some of my recent work. So I'm going to share with you a little anecdote here. Last year, I think it was last year, I put together this book, Finding the Voice of the River. And I was working with Palgrave, the publishers of the book, and they said, Gary, you have to have better words in your title. Finding the Voice of the River, that's poetry. And yet that doesn't work very well for search engines. You need better keywords for this, otherwise nobody will find your book. Your book is about management, Gary. Your book is about restoration, Gary. Those are good keywords for you. So for the subtitle of my book, I chose to call it Beyond Restoration and Management, because I hope I'm not writing this book for search engine purposes. I hope it's about the ways that we connect and we relate to river systems and maybe contemplate river systems as sentient entities and think about our relationships to our planet. And for the last few years, I've had the incredible good fortune of working with Maori colleagues, Indigenous colleagues here in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And it really has taken me to quite a different place in my understanding of societal relations and connections to river systems and the role of science in those deliberations. And to me, I've shifted very much into this perspective of how we live with rivers, societal relationships to rivers, not how we impose human authority upon rivers. And management really is about imposition of human values on top of those river systems. So we're not respecting their rights as living entities, adjusting entities. And there's a global scale resurgence, I think, in this kind of perspective, how we live with nature, how we live with river systems, and how we seek to work with them. And oftentimes this is placed under the rhetoric of nature-based solutions. And there was a very big UN conference in Rio, I think, a few years ago that published on this, on working with water cycle processes. Well, in some ways, my interest goes a little bit beyond the anthropocentric or anthropogenic perspective towards this, towards connecting with the values of the river itself. What are the rights of that river system? And just a couple of years ago, we published a paper on the rights of the river here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, showing the alignment between geomorphic perspectives on river systems and indigenous values, indigenous connections. So there is an inherent politics to what we do and how we do it. In geography, this is conducted under the auspices of what we call critical physical geography. And part of our role and our mandate and our ethical lens, I think, is to keep it real, to develop and apply what we call knowledges in place. So these are appropriately situated, appropriately contextualized knowledges. These are knowledges where those people who live in that particular landscape and relate to that particular system have understandings of that system, which must, in my view, be seen alongside theoretical assertions of what that river could, should, ought to be. This is that contestation that I mentioned at the outset around virtual landscapes relative to the value of field-based science. Geomorphology is in the midst of a revolution. The revolution in big data, machine learning, and modeling applications has enormous generative potential. It really is taking us to a very, very different space as an increasingly data-rich, predictive science. But from an ethical perspective, I think it's really important that we look at what we do in terms of the different meanings of landscapes. And in terms of all of those big data or machine learning applications, let's think about who writes the algorithms and from what perspectives have they written those algorithms. How do we hear the voice of the river? How do we respect the diversity of different landscapes? If somebody is working on development of algorithms that come from humid, temperate settings, how relevant are they going to be when we're dealing with ephemeral, arid, semi-arid systems, which have completely different hydraulic geometry relationships and discharge regimes or whatever? So I think it's really important that we are open to understandings or different meanings of landscapes and river systems. And there's some fantastic work, research in the geography space and in other kinds of branches of critiques of science. Donna Haraway has done some remarkable work on feminist critiques of science, showing how, this is kind of ironic given who your presenter is today, but the old white man syndrome or the colonizing knowledges perspectives shape the ways that science has been constructed with material realities on the ground, profound impacts for the ways that science is developed and the ways that science is used. And there's a wonderful book called Weapons of Math Destruction by O'Neill, just written in 2016, which talks about the ways in which algorithms are developed and the ways in which they're applied. And a lot of critiques of the ways that models have been developed and applied is available to us. I'm not remotely dismissing that work. It's absolutely fundamental to how we look at the development and uptake of geomorphology into the future. All I'm saying is, let's use that work wisely. Let's even learn from the experiences from the climate change debates, where if we're too assertive in terms of what we think we're doing, society will push our perspectives aside. We need to approach these things in a forthright manner, but cautiously. And working with Kirsty, we published a paper a few years ago called the plug-in paper. That's what we call it. It's in Wires Water. And that paper looks at how we can only represent landscapes or riverscapes to a certain degree using available technologies. And the answer to better forms of representation isn't necessarily just access to higher quality data. It's actually the questions that we ask and the way we go about conduct of what it is that we're doing. And so, working with colleagues, just earlier this year, we published this paper. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about these relationships between different forms of knowledge and understanding that underpin geomorphic inquiry. And so this diagram starts at what we can call this interpretation interface, where reading the landscape is the key to what we do in geomorphic practice. And essentially what I'm describing is what we call abductive reasoning, right? Reasoning in the light of what evidence or information is available to us. And so we call it a dark art of interpretation in geomorphology because it cannot be precise. We are always working with patchy evidence, the information that's available to us. A large part of geomorphic inquiry is working out what's been lost, what erosion has done, how it's taken things away and left us with the evidence that we can see and read in the field. So our interpretation interface builds around this describe, explain, predict notion, where ultimately the test of geomorphic understanding is how effectively and reliably we can predict how that information is relevant to any given situation. But what I wanted to point to is the information that underpins that process of inquiry, the relationships between big data across multiple scales, mechanistic models across multiple scales, field-based observations and measurement. These are looking beneath the surface, the importance of the sediment analysis that cannot be seen from remotely sensed applications, and how we relate this to place-based understandings, local and traditional knowledges, indigenous knowledges and relationships to that place. So the geomorphology to me is about how, to us as co-authors, is about how we interweave these different knowledges to inform predictions. And on the basis of that coherent body of knowledge or insight, we then inform management decisions. And we present our information to others and collaborate with others to undertake this work. All of this work is set within the prevailing theories that we're working with. It's set within space and time. And this is not a linear process. It seldom works in a linear way. It has light bulb moments. It has particular sets of circumstances like revolutions in understanding or particular personal moments when you see something and it makes sense to you. I'm a great believer in the role of instinct and intuition. And as I said, when I was on that trip with Clayton a few years ago, I just felt I had been there before. I was part of some of those landscapes. And it's also, this process is also subject to a range of different fireworks, particular moments where, whether it's floods or droughts or the Mariana experience in Brazil, you are semi-forced to approach things in different ways, to look at inquiry in different kinds of ways because the circumstances demand it of us. And so we go through these revolutions in practice. But to me, don't forget this word, the dark art notion, because to me that's this is not a cause and effect linear scientific endeavor. All right, spent quite a bit of time on that one, but the paper is there in Geomorphology, and it's an open access paper. So any of you who are interested in it, please have a look and send any questions our way. So the theme for what I'm talking to today is how do these different realities of the use of geomorphology play out in terms of the use of science to inform river management practices. And my perspective, or our perspective, Kirsty and myself, is very much one that we're not making good enough use of what we know, and contemporary approaches to management are not sustainable. Despite lots of societal and even political goodwill, river condition continues to deteriorate. In many parts of the world, we spend a lot of money on the process of river repair, but actually, to this stage, we haven't seen a lot of the improvements that we're aiming for. The pathway that we're on at present is failing to adapt to climate change. And this era of floods and droughts and bushfires and increasingly recurrent disasters is, we're not yet learning the lessons of how we need to take a different pathway in terms of approaches to the use of science to inform management practices. And in many instances, the more we continue on this path, the harder it becomes for us, because path dependencies and legacy effects of past practices make it really difficult to undo them. Think about, for example, the Mississippi River in the United States. Once you put stop banks or levees along those river systems, once you create an ethos in New Orleans that you're going to be safe and you're going to be protected, it's somehow unacceptable to think of it being any other way. So that's a burden for future generations, increasingly expensive to revoke decisions that have been made in the past. And despite the potential of an era of river repair, it's not really happening in ways in which it could be. To me, at the moment, river restoration practices are largely ineffective. They're still coming from this ethos of trying to impose human authority on rivers, where we've just simply changed the kind of state that we're trying to achieve. And to date, there are relatively few examples of coherent, proactive planning, where we apply integrated place-based knowledge to inform the practices that we apply at any given location. So to me, the focus should lie on efforts to live with living rivers. I mean, to me, we need to move beyond this prevailing command and control ethos. And I'd argue, and this is provocative, so I'm hoping that somebody's going to sort of come back and say, Gary, I don't agree with you. But I'd argue that to date, the approaches to geomorphologically informed river management have largely been undertaken through a geotechnically focused engineering geology lens, where the mandate is largely to keep landslides on a hill slope, to control river systems, to keep beaches in place. In other words, to control, assert control over nature, rather than learn to live with living and adjusting landscapes. Living with, not managing for. And to me, this lies within this imperative of working with nature and working with the river. And so, here in Aotearoa, we've been having, look, I'll call it fun, but it's a very serious issue that we've been dealing with. Many of our rivers have been strangled, we call it. Strangled means that we built lateral constraints. We call them stop banks, artificial levees, like the situation on the Mississippi River. And we've been writing, that's what I was doing earlier this morning, writing papers on how we can approach the rewilding of many of our rivers here in Aotearoa. What is possible where? A few years ago, Macaulay wrote a book called Silencing Rivers, or books on how rivers have been silenced because of the impacts of dams. We've taken away the voice of the river. In our work, we're talking about how many of our rivers have been strangled. They've had their freedom taken away from them. And what are the prospects to apply space to move interventions for these kinds of river systems? And there's a growing global movement in this direction. There's a special issue of the journal Ambio just a few months ago, which is about the design and uptake of nature-based solutions. And the principles defined by Albert et al. In that paper, the planning steps and the implementation guidelines directly accord with the principles that I'm going to be talking to today, right? So that there's direct alignment in the ways in which we can go about this kind of work from here. And geomorphologists have been doing this kind of work in really good ways for some time now. I've collaborated with Joe Wheaton in Utah, in the United States, quite a bit. And Joe's work has this fantastic sense of low-cost solutions for river restoration practices. And it's very much about the ethos of ways of living with river systems, where geomorphic principles in practice, from Joe and his colleagues' perspectives, apply these Riverscape's principles. And this was published in a book in 2019. Let's look very quickly through these principles. Streams need space. Structure forces complexity and builds resilience. The importance of structure varies at different locations through a system. And in many instances, inefficient conveyance of water is healthy. In other words, it's important to work with the river system that you have. Some river systems are very efficient conveyors of water and sediment, seeds, nutrients. Others aren't. We work with the types of rivers and the patterns of rivers that we have in any given instance. And in his work, Joe and others, and there's a fantastic paper just published in Bioscience by Ciotti et al., right, talk about design criteria for low-tech process-based restoration practices. And the ultimate aim of many of these practices is to create self-sustaining systems. Let the river make decisions. Let the river do the work. Use the materials that are available in that river system. And in these practices, it's okay to be messy. That's what healthy rivers are like in many instances. And there's strength in numbers. We have to tackle the problems at the scale of the problem. So there's this great potential and great promise, but as yet, we're not really embedding this in practice in ways in which we can. And to Kirsty and I, we're calling these the truths of the Riverscape. And what truths of the Riverscape are principles or practices that we hope will inform the management into the future in ways that we can learn from what's gone before. Because geomorphologists would argue that unless we incorporate geomorphic principles into management practices in the way that I've just shown from those slides from Joe Wheaton's work, unsustainable practices will continue and river health will deteriorate into the future. That's the truth. If we don't apply geomorphology effectively, those are the outcomes that will ensue. And I'd argue that we have a responsibility to be doing this kind of work because no one else is going to do geomorphology for us, right? No one else is going to take that next step for us. So unless meaningful use is made of scientific understandings, we're not doing our job as effectively as we could or we should be doing. This work follows on from some work several decades ago on the truths of the shoreline by Pilkey and colleagues in the United States. And Pilkey et al. Said, there is no erosion problem until a structure is built on a shoreline. Well, it's just the same for us with river systems, right? Floods are natural features of river systems. The notion of a flood is actually an anthropocentric notion. We expect floods to happen, and that creates a healthy river system. Pilkey went on to say that efforts to control coastal processes make problems worse. In other words, you put a structure on a coastline and you disrupt the process regime, and that has consequences elsewhere. Once you start to build these structures, you create these path dependencies, and their recurrent maintenance is needed. You oftentimes need to make these structures bigger, and they're increasingly expensive. Oftentimes we're merely transferring problems elsewhere. And these are issues of equity. Trying to stabilize the unstable selectively serves the interests of a disproportionate few who live along the shoreline. Taxpayers from elsewhere in a particular society are looking after the interests of those who live along that shoreline because of the image or mentality that we've created of what that should be. So in many instances, engineering measures destroy the beach that they were intending to save, accentuate rates of change or transferring problems elsewhere. And we'd argue, and the paper that we've just submitted to a journal basically says we've had the same issue in the management of river systems. We call them truths of the riverscape. Before I go into what these truths actually are, I want to point out one of the challenges that we face in the design and uptake of science. And I'm going to use Stan Sham's book here as a key indicator of what this challenge actually is. Stan Sham's book there is a wonderful way for us to reflect upon the challenges of geomorphology, but also the incredible fun that we have in geomorphic practice, because we are recurrently wrong. Each system has its own history. And that history, as I said earlier in the interpretation discussion, is selective. So we have to piece things together to tell the story of a given landscape. So in geomorphology, we've done a really good job of documenting the importance of complexity and contingency and emergence and nonlinear dynamics and how that shapes inherent uncertainty in the ways that we make predictions of the future. But there's a clash of cultures in terms of what management agencies want. Management agencies want standardized approaches that are deterministic, linear, apply reductionist principles in the quest for simplicity, replicability, ease of application, accountability. In other words, there's a clash of cultures in the ways that we seek to manage rather than live with river systems. And unless we address this dilemma, unless we apply knowledges in place that work for a given system, as I said, in my opinion, we're not doing our job effectively and river condition will not improve. So the four truths of the riverscape, which I'll talk to after a short break, are that we need to respect the inherent values of each river system, protecting the values of that particular place. Any practices that we undertake in geomorphologically informed management must be process-based. We must address the underlying causes rather than the symptoms of landscape change that's happening in ways that we don't necessarily like or appreciate. If we're going to make effective practices, we must move beyond uncertainties of such subjectivity in assessing the condition of these systems. So we must have a sense of what constitutes a healthy river system. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And unless we make this step of assessing condition, we don't know if management actions are actually helping or not. And the fourth truth that I'll talk to is the importance of interpreting evolutionary trajectory so that we can work out what is realistically achievable into the future. And unless we do that, we're not making predictions of where we can go from here. Okay, we will take a short break. I'm just going to get off this screen and go back to here and hit the stop sharing button in the hope that I can engage back with you and see if any of you have any questions or concerns or where we're at. And at least I can have a sip of tea now.
No, I think there is no questions yet, but I have some. If you okay with it?
Yeah.
But let's not talk about Manchester United situation to have a good talking. But I was listening to you and I was thinking, can I say that you propose that we we have to make human geomorphology, thinking about when I say human, that we can't forget of the people, the indigenous, the people on the rivers, and the society. We cannot look only to the process, only to materials. We can look to the society. We need to talk about it, and mainly when we had recently the United States conference about the climate, and how it works to the rivers, to the shoreline. But I think geomorphology think a lot about process and materials, but I think we need to talk more about the people in the watershed. And you talk about it all the time.
Yeah. I think that my perspective is moving a little bit beyond an anthropocentric perspective. It's definitely moving towards a more than human ethos, right? Ways of living on our planet, what stage of evolution may we be at on our planet. And I've noticed some comments here from Fernanda about, basically saying what is possible where varies massively. And here in a New Zealand context, in the Strangled Rivers work that we're doing now, we're creating what we're calling a contextual traffic lights situation, whereby urban situations where we have to protect infrastructure, they're red light situations. What we can achieve is really relatively limited in geomorphic terms. We can still enhance the health of the river, but it's going to be largely water quality management in those areas. Whereas there are other instances where we can yellow traffic light or green traffic light situations where we can envisage where changed relationships to the river, giving the river back some of its space, will allow it to be regenerative, and then will help us get a societal response in terms of connecting to a living river system. And at the moment, we've created this ethos where we oftentimes see river management as somebody else's problem, not for the people who are living along that system. And so to me, these are deeply contextual. I'm giving a talk that reflects my personal experiences in the parts of the world that I've had the fortune to work within, but I'm very conscious of the fact that we need knowledges in place, things that work for the local situation, and it needs to be informed by those practices. What I'm inclined to do, Clayton, is, I know we've got a little bit of time here, but I'm thinking maybe I will continue, if it's okay. Just people have had a couple of minutes to stretch. Or
yes, I think we had three questions here, but if you wish, you can continue.
So if you could look through the questions, and then you can, because I will not be able to follow all of the chat whilst I'm talking, but if you can sort of be the person that can intermediary work through those things. I will go back to my talk and work through the truths, right? And we'll see how we go from there.
So now I will separate the questions to the two.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So can I check, Clayton? Am I back on screen?
Yes.
And I can hit this, and I can hit the hide.
Okay.
And we can continue. Is that okay, everybody? All right.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back. These are the four truths, and I'm now going to spend the rest of the time talking through them and how they play out in different situations. So absolutely perfect for just what we talked about just a second ago is the importance to respect diversity. Look after the values of any given place, any given river system. Each river is important to the people who live along that particular system, right? And the values and connections that they have vary massively if you're in an urban area, in a rural area, if you're in a highly regulated river or a river that's running free. I'm not saying that everybody respects the values of the river itself. I'm just saying that the nature of those values vary massively for each river system. And all I'm saying is, unless we embrace place-based values, biodiversity management and sustainability programs will be compromised. So respecting diversity is important in life, in society, it's important with rivers. And so if we fail to apply the principles of this truth, then that means that we will generate inequitable outcomes in spatial and in social and in temporal terms. So there's remarkable diversity of river systems across our planet. And I've chosen examples here for which, other than a little bit of yak management on the Tibetan plateau, or a little bit of pasture land use in one of those rivers in Australia, or a little bit of, you don't know, but one of those rivers on the bottom there is a highly regulated river here in New Zealand. I've just chosen natural examples of diversity. We know that although rivers are just water flowing over bodies of sediment or around rock, wow, the diversity that's out there is just something to behold, something to cherish, something for us to respect, hopefully, in the management practices that we do. It's not one size fits all. Practices will not work. There is no magic number of types of rivers, right? There's just incredible diversity out there. Each river warrants our attention specially. As academics, it's our job to contextualize these relationships, and that contextualization, that classification or use of archetypes, informs the transfer of information from one situation to another. And through river styles applications and associated principles, we look at the spectrum of river diversity on the gradient from high slope to low slope situations, from high energy to low energy situations, from coarse grained to fine grained situations, but we relate it to the space that the river has got to adjust, differentiating between types of rivers in confined, partly confined, and laterally unconfined settings. And giving particular priority, I think, through this work to discontinuous watercourses, where we have quite distinct types of rivers in that flow on top of valley fill sediments. In conducting our work for 30 years or more, there's been this clear recognition of the importance of a cross-scalar nested hierarchical lens, and work by Frizzell and Neyman and Leroy Poff and others has really articulated the importance of looking at this interactions across scales. And Leroy calls them these landscape filters. But one scale impacts the others. These should be seen as interconnected scales. In geomorphic terms, from bed material size through landforms at the geomorphic unit scale, to assemblages of landforms at the reach scale, to catchment scale relationships where we have patterns of different types of reaches that are we can identify and characterize, and at the eco-region scale. These are really important relationships are important when we consider how we transfer understandings from one system to another. But critically, we need to make sure that in the applications that we come up with, if they're unduly prescriptive or oversimplistic, if they set out to make rivers the same, we're not doing our job. Our job is to identify and look after core values of each and every river. And one of the underlying premises that we use for that is this notion of knowing your catchment, understanding how catchment-specific sets of relationships impact upon the types and patterns of rivers and the conditions of rivers that you see in any given instance. And these principles are generic. They can be applied to urban rivers or rural rivers, highly impacted rivers, non-regulated rivers. These are geomorphic considerations that we take account of when we're thinking about how we live with or seek to manage that river. And associated with these kinds of general big picture principles There's a lot of interesting work on how riverscapes can be seen as cross-disciplinary templates. This is done purely within a scientific lens here, where we can look at relationships between geodiversity and biodiversity and the ways in which physical processes interact with ecosystem processes. And again, going back to the 1990s conference, work by Ana Luisa and others on these geo-eco hydro systems as really a bit of a revelation in itself, right, in the sense of how we put these different branches of science together. But if you go talk to indigenous peoples who have a sense of landscapes as holistic, integrative, indivisible entities, then they really struggle with notions of Western science, which chooses to pull all these different parts of knowledge apart. And oftentimes in management terms, we simply play off one set of science against another as a basis to contextualize or approach how we go about science. Just a very simple little comment about the ways in which some of these process relationships play out for different river systems. The geomorphic structure of some rivers can be very, very complex. So they are quite heterogeneous systems, right? So there's particular sets of habitat values for heterogeneous systems, whereas some rivers are actually quite homogeneous. So a lot of cut and fill river systems actually don't have a lot of diversity of river structure. So we need to be really, if we're working with the river, we need to understand and appreciate that diversity. I just want to draw your attention to some work that's just come out, published in the United States in the last couple of years, where they've now taken the notion of riverscapes and refer to it in socio-ecological terms. And I think this is a very healthy direction for us to go, to take us away from just a scientific lens to looking at this more holistic sense of what we mean by the term riverscapes. And to me, predicting futures of riverscapes, putting that socio-ecological perspective on it, is the way in which we should be going. So one of the very conventional distinctions that has been made in terms of use and development of geomorphology or uptake of geomorphology is process-based understandings. But really, it's the ways in which we use those understandings or the purposes to which we apply understandings of process. And the Kissimmee River here in Florida, when it was being engineered, processes were being used for a particular purpose, right? So the underlying politics of process applications was to flush sediments through that particular system, to create dry lands adjacent to the margins of the channelized river system, because there was a perspective of the river as being stable and a predictable entity. It pushed the river aside, but it also created, in this instance, high cost and high maintenance programs to keep the river like this, and highly degraded these systems. Whereas contemporary management practices, where possible, where practicable, and this is the traffic lights type system, recognizes landscapes as dynamic and uncertain, and where we can, we let the river create its own form and shape. And these processes create living ecosystems. They can be low cost to maintain, and our job here as human society is to monitor and protect what happens to the nature of these systems. So we apply process knowledges in different kinds of ways. So nature-based solutions and associated aspirations to meet UN Sustainable Development Goals really comes down to the ways that we perceive rivers as living, adjust, and disturbance-driven entities. Recognizing that if we try to fight the river, the river will fight back, and eventually it'll win. In a New Zealand context, in the ways that we are strangling the rivers of Aotearoa, we're saying that we are manufacturing future disasters. The more we constrain the river, the more the river wants to fight back. If we don't work with the river, we inhibit prospects to sustain its key processes, attributes, and functions. And we don't work with process, we address the wrong issues in the wrong way. It's expensive, it's inequitable, it creates problems for future generations. So it's really important to understand what kinds of processes create the rivers that we see along a river course, and how those different sections of river are connected to each other, and really embrace the principle that Stan Shum espoused in that landmark textbook, 10 Ways to Be Wrong, recognizing that some rivers are shaped by extreme events. So they're non-equilibrium relations of those systems, whereas others are shaped by frequent lower magnitude flows. And in a sense, the notion of bankful discharge as the control on a river varies depending upon the setting that you're in, the type of river that you're dealing with. And obviously, across the planet, rivers have different discharge regimes. So rivers are attuned to different roles of extreme events. I love these little mantras, ways of thinking about and relating to rivers, and in process terms, it's always interesting to reflect upon rivers loving sand. They can readily move that material wherever it's available. That whenever you're analyzing and interpreting a river, always look at the bed before the banks to look at controls upon the stability of the channel. And one of Joe Wheaton's lovely little expressions is to promote healthy diets and exercise regimes for rivers. Maybe a little bit anthropocentric again, because we try to do this for ourselves, but looking after ourselves that way is also a good way of looking after river systems themselves. If you want a healthy living river system, allow it to adjust. And part of this perspective relates back to the ways that we perceive things like flood events. And from a geomorphology perspective, I hope this is not news to anybody. Actually, we love floods. Floods drive the geomorphic behavior of the river. They inundate floodplains and regenerate soils on valley floors. They are fundamental to the behavioral regime of a river. The paper by Richard Williams, published in Stoughton just last year, basically says, you can't have restoration activities along a river unless you have floods, because floods drive restoration of the river. Gene Florsheim, back in 2008, created a wonderful paper on living with erosion and the importance of erosion in recreating, regenerating the physical habitat mosaic of river systems. The basic notion here is that erosion and deposition are good things. They're part of actually a healthy river system at the right rate at the right time. So working that out is really the role of a geomorphologist. One of the controversies or controversial areas that scientists are oftentimes very uncomfortable with is around areas of maybe more subjective assertions of what we know and how we know it, and the use that's made of that information. And so there's been great concern as to whether geomorphologists should be assessing condition or making statements about the condition of river systems. I do not think personally that we should put this aside and let other people be making those determinations on the information that we provide, independent from our perspective. Our perspective underpins the science that we do and how we do it, and we have opinions and perspectives that should, could, ought to be an important part of these determinations. If we don't measure condition in an appropriate way, we don't know if the health of a river is improving or not. If we don't monitor condition, we don't know if management actions are working or not. So we fail to learn from experience. So let's find ways of assessing condition in geomorphologically informed ways, manners. It's a truth of the riverscape. Again, reflecting upon connections back to indigenous perspectives or more holistic perspectives on landscapes and riverscapes, assertions of a healthy river interweave different knowledges or different perspectives. They look at the functionality of the entity as a whole. They look at things like the ways that life cycles work. They basically say, if any link in a chain is broken, the system is broken. Whereas all too often, from a Western scientific perspective, we've fragmented knowledge of river systems. So we have fragmented science that underpins fragmented management. All right, having said that, I'm now going to talk about geomorphic perspectives on assessment of condition. And in geomorphic terms, we need to be measuring things that give us a relevant signal for the type of river that we're dealing with. So, for example, when we're dealing with bank erosion, do we expect to see erosion along that river or not? I like to think of this in terms of open-ended methods and ways that we can adapt existing frameworks so that they fit for a particular system. And anything to do with condition assessment is shaped by what we measure against, what it used to be called the reference condition. And so geomorphologists are really good at helping determine what is realistically achievable in any given instance. In other words, what is the optimal state and function for that particular system. So Kirsty Priors has developed a whole suite of outputs related to this that builds upon foundation geomorphic understanding, that looks at what we measure against, what measures we choose to assess, where we measure them, when we measure it. And these values are importantly tied to the range of behavior of a river. They integrate knowledges of the flood behavior of a given river system. And so in the process of doing that, they recognize that if you measure the condition of a river before or after a flood, it's going to be different. That's part of the healthy regime of that particular system. So that contextual frame helps us to determine whether a river is in good, moderate, or poor condition relative to what is achievable at that location. And this is a caipirinha moment. The photograph at the top is the Masai, just outside Rio, where on the outside of a bend, such as this bend, erosion is expected. The river is just being a river. It's doing its thing. Guess what? That's what rivers do. Whereas in the lower image, which is an image from Australia, this is a river that's been subject to incision and lateral channel expansion, and rates of channel erosion and sediment loss from that system are out of phase with what would be expected for that particular system. In other words, it's had profound response to anthropogenic disturbance. Just the other day, I was reading a lovely book which was talking about how we conceptualize rivers and how we relate to the science of river systems. And this book sort of came up with this thing about, well, it's easy to do lots of tests to assess what human health would be and the health of a river system would be. But it's also important to engage with how a patient is feeling and get into some of those other dimensions that are beyond merely the biophysical, and think about those psychological relationships. And I have little hesitation in suggesting that the concerns for well-being are going to be expressed as much in mental and psychological terms going forward as they are going to be in biophysical terms. I just see that as a reality of what's coming. Okay, fourth truth is interpret evolutionary trajectory to determine what's realistically achievable. And this basically says that if we, the past management actions have largely been reactive. We've just waited for a river to change and then carried on doing the same old things to try to manage it, to keep it in that particular place. The notion that we have here is that geomorphology is not doing its job unless we develop proactive and precautionary management plans. And those proactive and precautionary management plans, that's the predictive part of geomorphology, they tell us what is realistically achievable for a given system. And so in geomorphic terms, in terms of river science and management, we need to understand what types of rivers we have, the patterns of those rivers, how they're connected at the catchment scale, and use understandings of those process relationships to scope prospective futures, to model those futures, to quantify predictions of those futures. For now, I'm not going to talk too much about this particular conceptualization, but it talks about notions of river recovery and how when we're informing management practices that we wish to prioritize, it pays to work with rivers that have or already show signs of recovery, because if we work with recovery, then small, low-cost interventions can achieve really good outcomes. And if recovery is happening, if we have to identify what recovery looks like for a given river system, then we can facilitate, enhance it, accelerate it. And ecologists have been using these notions for a long time, and in geomorphic terms, these principles have been around now for a couple of decades. The hope would be that through understandings of past trajectories, through understandings of river responses to disturbance events, including anthropogenic activities, we can explain the character of a river as it is today, but then we can project into the future to give a sense of what are realistically achievable target conditions under different management practices or different lenses that which we can construct these different scenarios. Whatever we come up with, we like to think of these prospective futures as moving targets, because the one thing that we know about the future is we cannot be certain what it's actually going to be like. So we wrote the paper on the Masai with Monica and others just a few years ago that looked at how these kind of principles played out for a river system in Brazil. Just a couple of quick comments on working with recovery. There's been some really interesting work that Kirsty has led in Australia recently about how revegetation of valley floors, because of, believe it or not, because of drought-induced pressure, which reduced land use stress, riparian vegetation improved, the condition of riparian vegetation increased, and it meant that subsequent flood events were much less geomorphically effective. So actually, erosion and sedimentation problems downstream were greatly reduced after revegetation occurred. So working with the river, working with recovery, facilitates improvement in river condition. And I just wanted to draw your attention to another paper that we did just with Ronnie Popple and others on how catchment scale sediment management informs recovery analyses, and how these relationships of where rivers get their sediments from, how different connectivity relationships have been changed, they vary from system to system. And it points to the importance of context, place-based understandings to inform these applications. All right. The assertion that we would have is that when we are trying to pull together the understandings that come from these different geomorphic principles around these different truths, right? So we have the 4 truths in here. We're shaping river futures. The prospects for the future reflect catchment-specific considerations. So they reflect contextual considerations. Am I in an urban catchment? Am I in a rural catchment? What is the story of that particular system? But it also reflects, and everything is set within this policy and institutional setting. So these considerations underpin what proactive and precautionary catchment plans look like. In terms of some principles that we would advocate in terms of moving forward, be bold, be visionary, but realistic. Develop programs that you address the causes rather than the problems. Make sure you tackle problems at source, at the scale of intervention that's required. Don't create problems elsewhere. That's the principle of treatment response. You want to minimize negative off-site impacts, whereby in tackling one problem, you don't create others elsewhere. Look after the good bits. The conservation first ethos applies. Identify threatening processes, what are likely to be threats into the future, particularly if threshold conditions can be breached and completely transform the system. Recovery-based principles, and there's lots of publications on this now, provide a geomorphically informed platform, what I would regard as an ethical platform to consider how we prioritize what we do, because it has implications for intergenerational equity. And look at those catchment scale relationships as a basis, right, to inform what is realistically achievable. And then, of course, monitor what you do, learn, adapt, work out when we can just stand back and let the river do its own thing. Am I in a green traffic light, a yellow traffic light, or a red traffic light situation? Carefully consider the history of that particular system and how it's at different stages of adjustment when you think about the transfer of information to different situations. Model scenarios for any given instance, quantify the likelihood of these different prospective futures. And don't be scared to experiment. So long as you document effectively, right, and you have a clear rationale for what it is that you're doing, that's how we learn. That's one of the truths of the Riverscape, right? And we've got to be have that commitment to experimentation. All right. I'm just going to have a couple of closing slides that reflect upon how these kind of relationships play out. We've just finished a paper on geoethical futures, a call for more than human physical geography. And in that paper, we look beyond an anthropocentric assertions of the ways that we live with our planet. In that particular paper, we look at 3 physical geography case studies. There's a rivers case study, there's a soils case study, right? And there's a case study from air quality that look at more than human considerations that we can look at alongside particular social and cultural concerns for the ways that we live with our world and we live with our planet. And I think this is part of a growing global movement which recognizes the rights of nature on the one hand and recognizes the importance of nature-based solutions on the other. One of the great joys about what we do, particularly as a river scientist, is that we share stories in river systems. Particularly for me, I love this notion of conversations along a river. But I like this lens of listening to the river and learning from it and letting the river speak. And we have a major project here in New Zealand at the moment with Anne Salmond and others that looks at assertions of digital rivers, how we create digital representations of rivers. But then how do we interweave those representations with indigenous stories, indigenous connections, indigenous relations? Because that is the story of the river, that combined perspective. In terms of personal next steps, yes, well, at the moment we have a book planned on truths of the Riverscape, and yes, at the moment, unfortunately, that's about as far as we've got in terms of where we're at with it. In summarizing what we've been talking about, or what I've been talking about here, I would say that we need a revolution in practice, or a revolution in the uptake of how we use geomorphology. That contemporary approaches are not sustainable. We're ill-prepared for climate change adaptation. We've not learned lessons from those truths of the Riverscape, and hopefully those platforms give us a basis to move forward from here. And that there's an inherent geopolitics to this, and inescapable in terms of how we move forward. But at the very least, we can make sure that we do our job as effectively as we can to support steps to move forward. So I'll leave it there and invite any questions or comments, and hopefully I've provoked some reflections on these kinds of issues, and we'll see what you guys make of what I've come up with.
Yes, there are a lot of questions that appeared, and I think I can more than one in one question.
Yeah.
Kleber Moleta said, Professor Gary, considering that much of the world's population lives in cities. How can river restoration, even the low-tech, be implemented in such changed landscapes? And Geraldo Rocha said, congratulations, Professor. I would like to know how it's possible to prevent urban floods without using methods and actions of engineering geology.
Yep. Fantastic questions, and I'm not trying to sit on a fence, because I don't do that, right? I have quite a strong and assertive set of perspectives that we draw towards these. Everything is contextual. In many instances, people have chosen to live, or whatever different sets of circumstances have conspired that people live in particular places that are not necessarily very sensible. And we have to live with it. Managed retreat is extremely controversial. People do not like to be told what to do. They do not like to be told that they have to move. Things like flood insurance programs are going to change for certain parts of the world, right, in terms of perspectives or responses to who can afford to live where. It will inevitably change under the circumstances that we're dealing with. Everything that I've said, and please, if people have got contrary perspectives to this, please let me know. I'm trying to articulate principles from geomorphology that we can adapt to a given situation. And much of what I said was about working out what is realistically achievable for that particular situation. So urban rivers are massively important because that's where people do live. Those are the rivers that people relate to, that they connect to. And in some parts of the world, there are initiatives to do things like rewild urban streams, to take streams out of pipes. We had a lovely Maori paper here in New Zealand about, we called it Buried Alive. The river had been buried alive and put into a pipe. And how can you have a social and a cultural connection to that river? How can you express your ancestral links to that river system? You know, because remember here for Maori, I am the river and the river is me. You have an ancestral connection to that river system. That river is a part of who you are, and it's been taken away from you in that particular context. That's here in Aotearoa. That's a particular social circumstance. And it's very, very different for all the rivers in Brazil. That there's a very different context for each river system, and each river tells its own story. And so it's what is realistically achievable for that instance. Some of the best river restoration practices have been for urban streams. If you look at the winners of the International River Prize, so far to my knowledge, never from Brazil, right? But if you look at the winners of those international prizes, they are largely about ecological improvements through socially acceptable programs. Just look at the winners. Chicago was one of the winners. San Antonio was one of the rivers. The Thames in London was one of the rivers. There's a whole suite of initiatives and interventions that can be undertaken to improve the health of those river systems. Maybe in some ways, if the situation is so bad, small improvements make a big difference. It's I don't want to talk about the specifics of particular instances. Maybe in this instance, I'm just thinking as I'm answering this now, maybe in this instance, we would say these are low recovery potential rivers in geomorphic terms. But in reality, geomorphology is not the priority for many of those river systems. It's a very political question of who lives where and what is the quality of the water in those systems, because there's not much that can be done in geoecological terms for those particular instances. We have to live with the river as it is today and seek to improve its condition.
It's perfect. About politics, yet. Alberto Lacerda say, I believe the reason we are falling to adapt to the climate change is because the environment is treated as a political issue instead of technical or scientific issue. And that's hard to beat. Do you agree? And Nara Rubia says, Gary, great to talk so far. Talking about politics, what do you think about the separation of environmental politics and water resources politics? Is it a problem for the rivers? Do we need a river politics?
Look, for me, in simple terms, right, and I'm going to be a little bit indigenous, sorry, a little bit idealistic. I purposefully wore my Australian Indigenous flag today for my talk, right? Because this is the world that in reality I embrace, and I'm not trying to speak on behalf of anybody else. I'm just saying I have learned so much from sharing perspectives and understanding different worldviews in relating to this. And the biggest lesson I've learned is that unless we adopt a whole of system perspective, that's the scientific language, a holistic perspective, then practices will fail. Because if we set agendas up against each other, then the river will lose and society will lose. I do not believe, I call it lowest common denominator outcomes. Compromise solutions do not work. What is half a habitat? The life cycle of a river only has any chain, the weakest link that is broken, compromises the integrity of the system. For me, this word, integrity, will be more important than resilience for the future. Because integrity is not about just what we want to achieve, a whole of system perspective, but it is also about the way we achieve it, the integrity of what we do and how we do it. So I personally do not believe that the future lies just in technological solutions and our ability to interact with or contemplate living on Mars, right? For me, technocentric solutions are very, very important, but they are a part of the issue. It's about the ways that we live with things. And I will be honest, my Indigenous flag today is from Australia. And I am disgusted, personally, at the Australian national government's role at the climate change talks last week, where they just push the issue aside and say, technology will provide us with all the answers in the future. That is completely irresponsible from a future generation perspective. It simply makes it somebody else's problem, and we are not doing our job and living up with the responsibilities of the circumstances that we have created or been involved in creating.
Yes, and you are saying it for a long time. Yes. Continuing in some political themes, but more related with the terms you used. Guilherme Vilas Boas said, Gary, you sometimes used the word sustainable. Some authors associate this word to the maintenance of the capitalist process of exploitation of natural resources, such as rivers, with a green touch. I know this issue is long and takes a lot of time to debate, but it would be possible for you to explain us which sustainable you to me and to whom?
Yeah. May, thank you for the question. I do not have a little kiwi that I can show you, but the kiwi is with you, my friend. It is a good question, and I get very, very frustrated about the ways that environmentalists are really good at creating good language for good intent, for good purposes. And the language is, if you'll excuse the expression, but it becomes bastardized by the ways that other people choose to use that language. So the intent of sustainability and the intent of resilience was a very, very good notion initially in the way it was designed. But for example, today we hear talks of change resilience. What does that mean? Or engineering resilience. Well, that's just building something that doesn't change. The term becomes abused and used in a different sense. And I think that has happened to the word sustainability. And for me, I use sustainability through a socio-cultural lens, not through a socio-economic lens. I don't refer to sustainability in the sense of sustainable development, which implies growth. I use it in the sense of the ways of living with the system in equitable ways that embrace a more than human lens, that look at our the privilege and honor that we have as being a part of this earth and the ways that we relate to it from that perspective.
Yes, we have to think about it all the time. There are 2 or 3 more questions, but I can associate it. Marcelo de Oliveira Latuf said thanks for the lecture. And in Brazil, as you know, the energy matrix is through the hydraulic use of rivers, and in some hydroelectric plants, artificial fluid pools are generated, but the size and diversity of fish have been decreasing year after year. How to integrate this energy matrix in a broad management with the perspective of river environments? And Henrique Oliveira, thank you for the exchange of experience. And I want to know how we can understand and explore in a sustainable way the rivers, respecting the particularities of its natural configuration and its complex relationship with the people who benefit directly and indirectly from them.
Like you have just done, Clayton, they're really good and they're really directly interlinked questions. So thank you for that, and thank you to for those questions. I think this is the we're looking at the quest for a coherent synthesis, right? That's a little bit of artificial academic talk, but we're looking for taking the next steps together collectively to achieve the best that we can do in ways that use the science that we do in geomorphology, right? So I thought that the first question, Marcelo's energy matrix relationships, I'm not so directly familiar with those experiences, particularly related to flow releases and maximizing the benefits that come from them. But we have made immense gains in the last generation, right, through allocation of environmental flows. And personally, I'm absolutely delighted to see the ways that in some parts of the world that those environmental flow allocations are not just biophysical, they're related to spiritual and cultural connections that the different indigenous groups have along river systems. And I hope that in designating those flows, we can have a more holistic approach to think about the values that can be generated or accrue through them, right? So, and in relation to the second point, the importance of respecting, I think that maybe a slightly tangential response, but I fear that as a society, we have become disconnected from our rivers. We've become disconnected from our instinctive relations of what it is to be human and how we relate to the world around us. And I think we just need to get out more and wander along rivers more and connect and relate to them and listen to them. What's the river actually saying? I had a bizarre conversation just the other day with somebody who knows somebody who lives in Kampala, right, in Africa. And they were talking about this person has a block of land and they're elderly, wondering what to do with it, right, as they transition in their life. And I just suggested, go listen to the land. What is the land saying? What is the legacy that you can leave, right, through that land for the future of that particular place? What do you want it to be like? And I think that we are field scientists, ultimately. We're very passionate about getting out and being as part of these places. We're very privileged, I think, to have that role, but we need to listen more, and we need to share perspectives upon these things, not be prescriptive, not be deterministic, just open our minds a little bit more to thinking about things in different ways.
Professor Gary, I think we had a good number of questions, and you gently answered that. But I think we are close to end this conversation. But I need to tell you that you are a very you inspire everyone who knows you. Your passion for science, your passion for the rivers, your passion for to associate the rivers, the nature, the landscapes, the society, the people, and is very inspiration. This make inspiration to us. So I thank you with about your talks, about your conversations here, but not only here, but every time you come to here in Brazil. I think we met three times, I think, but there will be more. I know.
I surely hope, my friend, and look, I think that the sharing experiences is the crux. I really appreciate the questions and the ways that we're always learning, right, through these interactions. I just wanted to say that I'm very happy for the talk and for the which has some of the references at the end, for it to be shared. So if you wanted through Sinagio, if you wanted to make that available to others, then that's fine for me. Okay.
Yes. You are always welcome, friend, to Brazilian geomorphology. So,
well, thank you, Clayton. Thank you to the whole committee, and
thank you.
We look forward to being in person next time round. But actually, I hope this way was not so bad.
Yes. I think it's hard to talk onto a screen, but
yes,
the next time you talk to a lot of people.
Yes,
I know it.
All right, my friend. Take care, everybody. All the very best. Enjoy your summer.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Muito obrigado, pessoal, por ter acompanhado até aqui. Então, nós vamos encerrar e aguardamos todos vocês nas próximas etapas do Sinagel. Amanhã tem mais, né? Não percam. Um abraço.